Welcome to Ascend. I'm Alaya, sex, life, and parenting coach, and I'm so excited to be hosting this podcast. In my life, I'm always seeking higher, better, deeper, and I want to help you do the same. One orgasm? Let's have multiples. Fine childhoods? Let's give children wonderful ones. Learning to live with trauma? Let's heal and thrive post-trauma. Friends and spouses? I want soul connections and wild lovers. This podcast is an invitation. This podcast is a revolution. This podcast is ascension. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Ascend with Alaya. Today, you are tuning in for episode number 4. So in our first 3 episodes, we explored masculine and feminine energies, how they play into the relationships in our lives. And today's episode is also exploring relationships in our lives of a very different nature. I'm not sure if most of you are familiar with the life and legacy of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, who was a very influential figure in my life, passed away recently, and a big part of the legacy and his life's work was speaking out about abuse in religious communities and domestic violence, and really educating people on how to prevent abuse, how to heal from it, how to support it, how to leave it, etc. And because I have been so touched by his life and his legacy, it felt so meaningful and important to me to do an episode exploring domestic violence and abuse within relationships, and specifically within religious communities. And I am so honored and so grateful that one of my clients, who has been through an abusive relationship herself, has agreed to come on to my podcast today and share her story with all of us. So we have changed some of the names and identifying details about her life and her family's basic identifiable information, but the story that she will share and the experiences are all factual, all accurate, and I am so looking forward to all of you hearing this episode, so that if you yourself are in an abusive relationship, or if you love somebody in an abusive relationship, or if you want to ensure that the people that you love never end up in abusive relationships, I hope you'll find this episode informative and illuminating and helpful. And I hope that it has some sort of an impact on your life and the life of people around you. So, Yael, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you coming on to my podcast and being so willing to share your story with everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. Needless to say, as someone that's now from the outside looking in, this is a topic that I am so very passionate about, and what kind of want to shed light to many a time stays in the closet.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think it's so powerful that you are willing to share your story on a public platform, even with, your identifiable details change, because so many people, when they're in abusive relationships and even once they're out of it, just carry this secrecy around with them and don't share their stories enough. And it's so brave and courageous for you to share your story, because the more, as you'll share, there were some moments in your story where just hearing about it or reading about it was so illuminating for you. And now you get to do that for other people. So that's a huge turnaround for you, I'm sure.
Yeah. And for me, I would say, we'll get into it later, but so much central to me in, the worst of times was feeling so alone and so lost. And so from my side, if there's just one person that gets helped and feels less lost and less alone, it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'm sure that there will be much more than one person, but yes. So why don't we start off with you telling us just the basics about your childhood, your family life before you met your now ex, what your upbringing was like, just some of the basic details.
So I grew up in the younger part of a family. We were a family of 4 in your typical Borough Park / Flatbush type community. So like think Beis Yaakov, not Hasidish, but Haimish. I really had quite the lovely upbringing. My parents had a nice marriage. We were very loved. We were very much encouraged to get out, believe in yourself. You can do anything you want to accomplish. So I actually really credit my mom very much with in her raising me to really instilling in me a level of self-confidence that even in the hardest of times still was kind of flickering and, continued to be there.
Yes. And I think that it's so powerful that that's your background because you really change the face of what we perceive, with like the image that we have as victim, right? When we think of a woman who's a victim in an abusive relationship, we typically think of somebody with an extremely troubled background or somebody that experienced a lot of trauma or somebody that must have had terrible parents or somebody that to begin with had no self-esteem. And when we have that one very narrow picture in our mind of victim, we really, really, really miss so many of the real victims out there because you are proof that abuse does not discriminate in that sense, and abuse does not pass over people from well-adjusted, warm, loving homes, and then only zoom in on people with trauma or problematic backgrounds. That everybody can land up in a situation like this.
Yeah, and I think also it's interesting for me that like in my family, life was nice. My parents were comfortable, but we spoke about like tough topics. Like I remember my mother saying, we talked about domestic violence in some way, shape, or form. My mom would say like, the first time a man raises his hand, that's when you leave. They were like idioms, that I was raised with that I guess were part of the foundations that I then, as I experienced life, was able to draw back into. Not always able to act on it the way I thought I would in retrospect, but I wasn't raised in a bubble where everything was beautiful and life was just perfect. I think I understood that there were, ups and downs in life and different people experience different situations. But for the most part, I think my life prior to meeting my ex-husband was pretty close to textbook nice.
Charmed. Sounds charmed and healthy. Yeah. And it's so powerful that you ended up in that experience and that you ended up in a marriage like that. And it makes it so much more kind of impactful to really explore your story because it helps us apply it to so many more people. It just broadens who ends up a victim in a situation like this and how we can support. So yes, we will get into all of that. I want you to start now by telling us, first of all, how old were you when you started dating your ex?
How old was I when I started like shidduchim? I was 20 and I met my ex-husband when I was 21.
Okay, so for those of you listening who don't come from Orthodox Jewish backgrounds and aren't familiar with some of the words that we're using, shidduchim is the like Orthodox version of matchmaking dating. That's the phrase for it. And the type of community that Yael is from is pretty much like a very traditionally Orthodox Jewish community. When she says she grew up in, Borough Park, Flatbush area, there was a very insular, very populated Orthodox Jewish community, just to give you all some background. So you started dating in general at around age 20 and you started dating your ex when you were 21. So now how long did you two date for?
Whirlwind. It was just a few weeks.
Okay. And you say the word whirlwind now, but back then that was a very normal amount of dating time. Most of my friends dated for that amount.
No, actually, I had gone out with people for a more extended period of time. This courtship was a whirlwind. It was, if I could just take a step back. So I never spoke to a boy before I started dating for marriage. So really, I didn't really know what to expect, right? And I guess I was one of the quote unquote lucky ones where I did have dates, but many of my friends got married at 18, 19, 20. So I was actually one of the older ones in my friend group. And I had like, I don't want to call it relationships, but I had dates with other boys that, like kind of petered out at the end because it just wasn't going to go for marriage. And you just sometimes have to make a clinical decision if you're going to continue or not. But with my ex-husband, I had this whiplash of what back then I thought was falling in love, like this connection, shall I say, where you feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you were dating him, because I know that you shared with me that on the one hand there was this almost intangible chemistry, like this just sense of I know you, and that felt like this click for you, right? Like that it was like something about this I'm being drawn to. It's right. There's some sort of immediate pull to it. But while you were dating, were there red flags?
Not in retrospect, clearly, several. But back when I was in it, it was just like, wow. I mean, look, he in one of our very early dates told me about an incident that he had, a road rage incident, where honestly, I don't know where I parked it in my brain because I am quite intelligent and, I don't lack for, for processing, but somehow, I don't know, potentially the connection I felt overshadowed really interpreting what he had said to me because, I wonder, like, why didn't I say it to my mom who would have said, like, yeah, you're not dating him anymore, right? Back then, in the beginning dates, it really just works as you kind of make a decision together. But yeah, clearly, the whole whirlwind of like falling fast and deep is, now I know in retrospect is also, um, you know, one of the markers of what may turn into an abusive relationship because it's essentially going so fast and furious. You don't really have a chance to process what you're feeling and all the elements of what you're feeling. And in a world where you don't know what it's like to talk to a boy and you don't know what it's like to have a normal dialogue with a boy, or you don't know what it's like to like a boy, right? Then, I guess that back then for me was like akin to the romance novels I had, read, in my high school years. So it was the element of being in a relationship or really liking someone from the other gender, someone that was, you perceived to be your potential future husband, overshadowed what if I would have dated in a slower, more steady, more thoughtful manner. I probably, may have walked away.
When I'm hearing you talk, like two words come to mind: chemistry and then compatibility. Right, where when we're dating, it's important to be on the lookout for both. We're not going to just look for compatibility because we're not looking for roommates. We're not looking for business partners. We're not looking for platonic friendship. Right. So chemistry does matter, but we're also not solely going on chemistry and the excitement and the rush, and the pull and the romance. We need to also sit with the compatibility. And when we talk about compatibility, we're not just looking at like, do we have the same life goals, right? Do we, when we paint our lives, do they match in terms of what we want to do? And we're also looking at compatibility in terms of personality and characteristics, right? Like, am I going to be compatible with somebody who has road rage? Am I going to like that type of really healthy compatibility where chemistry can actually overshadow all of that, and then we form a fantasy bond where we are in a really beautiful relationship with a complete fantasy instead of, you're dating what is. So you're dating, you're getting engaged, you're marrying what is. And what is road rage, right? Like, and the fact that it stands out to me till today tells me that it wasn't just a simple case of getting frustrated at a driver near you.
Oh, no. There was some violence involved. So yeah. It's probably one of the things I look back at and say, how did you not end it there? I mean, in retrospect, there's so many, how could you, how did you, that you can say, but probably, yeah, that's probably the thing that astounds me the most because it was early enough, I think on first or second date where I probably could have backed away, but somehow the fact that I felt that I clicked with him, the fact that he was so charming, the fact that he kind of came across as humble, he wasn't really, but came across as like just endearing and sweet, didn't reconcile with the other fact set, and used all the right buzzwords about how many years he wanted to learn and how he perceived the kind of family he wanted to have. So in a column, when you kind of put the pros and cons, somehow I failed to register that in the con column.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's very, very common. Is people get very stuck on paper. They're not really trained or educated or encouraged to focus on the in-person personality, day-to-day common behavior compatibilities. And that's something that we can start changing when we are, coaching young men and women into starting to date, is to really encourage them to focus on what are you seeing right in front of you, not just like what vision do you both have for when you have 3 kids and a beautiful, holiday family meal together, but what's right in front of you today. Is that feeling okay for you? And speaking of what's right in front of you today, you had told me about some boundaries of yours that you violated when you were dating as well. Dating engaged.
Engaged. Yeah, he didn't, we got engaged so quickly, there weren't many boundaries that he could violate. But yeah, no, I was, should I say nice from girl that really, kind of followed the footsteps of what I was told. And I passionately felt that way. Like I wanted a house of Torah, and I wanted, my children to grow up in a, home of Torah. And I wanted somebody that was going to sit and learn. And I was really, I felt it with every fiber of my being. I wanted a life that kind of continued the generations of who we are. And so, I mean, clearly we were very attracted to each other, but like, without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, we were going to be Shomer Nagia. It wasn't like, are we? It was of course.
Mm-hmm.
But over the course of us being engaged, and it wasn't that long of an engagement, it was somewhere between 3 to 4 months, there were times where he got physical, and I remember, I was so, I don't know what the right word was, in love, enamored, in this cloud of like euphoria. And I remember saying to him, like, I really want to walk down pure to the chuppah. And it was touching. It was, no consummation per se, but still, I remember feeling so guilty about it. And then thinking like, do I say something? It's like part of it is my fault. Like I was clearly a participant. But in retrospect, when I look at it, I did say no, right? And my requests for my personal space were not, look, it wasn't like he forced himself on me. He convinced me, right? And, when you're in this relationship where you've never had any sort of physical intimacy before, for one, it's like magic, right? It's like this chemical combustion, but also, I remember just feeling so disappointed in myself more than anything else. Like, I should have figured out a better way. Maybe it was me. But yeah, I think, we'll get to it later on in our marriage. There were other things where he kind of boundaries that I wanted and ways I wanted to kind of the confines of our marriage to be in, he didn't respect either. So I guess it was a fair foreshadowing of what was to come. And probably I will say that after lots of therapy, I understand that I was scared of him, even in our engagement. I probably didn't, the thought didn't crystallize during our engagement, but in retrospect, I could have kept saying no, right? So why did I stop? I think I was scared.
And our unconscious recognizes so much of what our consciousness doesn't. And our unconsciousness picks up on almost like all the important things approximately within 4 hours of meeting a person. So even if it took you years to kind of crystallize, like you said, and put into words that what you felt back then was fear or this sense of don't push this man too far. If you push this man, there will be consequences to pay. Your unconscious would have recognized that way back then, like that. So it's like, I can't say no more than, this one or two soft times, or I will pay the price for it. Like your unconsciousness would have recognized that.
Yeah.
So just for those of you listening who aren't familiar with some of the terms that Yael just mentioned, in Orthodox Judaism, in some sects of Orthodox Judaism, couples remain completely physically abstinent, like no physical contact until they are married. So no physical contact with anyone of the opposite sex, and then when they marry one specific person. So even when a couple is engaged, when obviously it gets much harder, when there's chemistry, right, and there is no hormones raging, it gets much more difficult, but couples really adhere to these religious protocols. So when we talk about the fact that you pushed these boundaries of yours, right, and that you ended up having like physical contact and sexual intimacy with each other, that's just a complete violation of your boundaries, right? So whether or not you agree with the religious stance on it, whether you're listening to this and thinking, what, that's crazy, why would they not touch when they're engaged? Regardless of that, it's no different than somebody violating any of your boundaries. And really, right, in another setting, well, I'm going to say it in this setting as well, what we're describing here is sexual assault. We're not talking, this is not consensual. You expressed that it was a boundary of yours. You said no. At that point, whether it happened, sweetly, or whether you even physically enjoyed it, right, or whether you didn't, run screaming and report him to the police, regardless, this is a form of sexual assault, right? Completely pushing past your boundaries. And I've heard this before. I have heard this happen. Religious couples that when they're dating or engaged, one is pressured into having physical intimacy after they've clearly expressed that this is a boundary they would like to honor until after they get married. And I think it's so important for people hearing this to know that is violating, that is a complete breaking of somebody's boundaries. It is a form of assault. And I want you all listening to this to know that you can absolutely say no to that when you're dating and engaged. And if the person that you're in a relationship with cannot respect that, that is 1000% a red flag to pay attention to. It's not like, oh, it's just like so hard for him because like we're just so excited and it's just so hard for him to wait. And like, this is not going to show up in any other area of our life. This is just because he still wants to touch. No, those are rationalizations. You need to very seriously address that. And, like Yael said, if you feel like you can't address that on some level, really, really tune into paying attention to that. And as well, I think it's so important for parents hearing this because obviously this is statistically happening more where, the men are pressuring the women. That's just facts. It's really important for parents and educators and dating coaches and rabbis and teachers who are speaking to these men to very, very, very emphatically tell them what it means to break this boundary for a woman and how it is violating and it is a form of assault. And they absolutely cannot do that. Like it's important to say that out loud, explicitly.
Let's move on. There's so much more to unpack.
So you're married now. Tell me some of the early marriage red flags. What was going on in your marriage?
Okay, so I will say that pretty close to the very beginning of our marriage. I mean, we got married in New York and we were one of those couples that went to Israel for the beginning of the year, for our start of our marriage so we can learn. And I would have to say, I think in the first month when we were still in New York, I realized, I don't think we argued during our engagement, which is interesting to me, but I realized that there were times that he got upset where it went from 0 to 60. And what I mean by that is like, look, I think it's okay to disagree. It's okay to be upset. It's in the beginning when you're kind of essentially so attuned to each other's moods, right? And like, if he's upset, you're upset because you're upset that he's upset. You're really kind of connected to each other. The ranges of how he got upset were extreme. And the best example I can give is somewhere in the first month of I cried. I look back at those, like the first month, and I know that I shed a lot of tears. And I shed a lot of tears because I was confused, because it just felt a little off in the realms of normalcy. I know that he threatened divorce within the first month of the marriage, to the extent that I remember somebody had gifted us Rabbi Victor Miller marriage tapes. And somewhere in that tape that we were listening to in the car, it said, like, the 10 things you can't say. And one of them was, if you're not allowed to say the word divorce. And I remember thinking in my head, like, oh, well, we did that one already. Now at this point in my life, when I look back at little me at 21, that's just ridiculous, right? Like, you should be able to disagree without the final threat of ending a marriage. So elements of being unsafe. But I will say there was extreme happiness during that time too, right? We went on a mini honeymoon, things. He was very effusive in his love and his, expressions of love. And so it was just very hot and cold, mostly hot, but some extreme colds. And by colds, I mean lows, right? So the down of the roller coaster. But inevitably, it would go back up. When we moved to Israel, I should say that I got pregnant within 2 months of being married. I just remember crying a lot. I cried just because he was mean. I cried because somehow I was at the butt of his jokes. I cried because I just probably couldn't understand what I was feeling, but I knew I was feeling like this isn't what I expected, right? My parents had a nice marriage. My parents argued, but they respected each other. They got through it. We saw them apologize to each other. Like wasn't perfect, but it was healthy. And I think early on, I recognized that it wasn't healthy. One, because it ramped up from 0 to 60 really quickly. And beyond the emotions running so high, it was like essentially, well, fights ended somewhere like you were off the cliff already. So there was very little steady ground. And I remember in the first year of our marriage, I said to him, I said, I don't think we fight well. I think we should go speak to a therapist. I think we should go speak to a marriage counselor. And he said to me, no, never. I'll divorce you before we go for help. So I guess that was a bit of the groundwork.
And that is so, so important. You mentioned things that I think is really important for couples to hear, individuals to hear. Those in itself are red flags. First of all, you are not supposed to spend the first year of your marriage time. That's outside the range of normal. And I know that people are told, your first year of marriage is an adjustment. It can be hard, and there will be times where you won't feel great or it will be sad. It's so important to specify how much of that falls within the range of normal. Sure, your first year of marriage might be challenging at times, but it is not supposed to be so difficult.
Right.
You might cry at times for being sad, but you are not meant to cry all the time. In your first year of marriage, the two of you might get into arguments, but they are not supposed to be explosive, out of nowhere arguments that all end with the two of you, like you said, off the cliff. It's so important for people to know that there is a range of normal, healthy conflict, and then there's a range of conflict that becomes really concerning, really abnormal, and totally beyond the range of healthy. And the other point that you made that I so want to reiterate is when somebody reacts like that to the mention of therapy, massive, massive red flag. People that are that resistant to therapy have something to hide. People that are that vehemently opposed to having an outsider who has an education, who has a degree, who has knowledge, who can essentially spot their crap and call it out, those are the same people that are going to so effusively, just resist and push against therapy And that is something to really pay attention to and see for the red flag that it is. There's a reason why they don't want somebody observing them.
Yeah, agreed. And here I was pregnant. I just remember feeling like so despondent. When I look back and I ask, like, why didn't I just call my parents right away? Why didn't I call out the elephant in the room early on? I mean, because I did understand that there was something that I would put in quotes as off. Like something was not right. We were all a bunch of friends. We were all kind of married at the same time. I had observed other of my friends' relationships and I know every relationship's different and you can't compare, but this one was really, today you would say like well off the bell curve of normal. I think back at like how difficult it wasn't difficult, but how I perceived how difficult shidduchim were and how difficult it was to find somebody, how much money my parents spent on the wedding, that my parents were sending us money to support us, and this like extreme guilt. And also there were many, many moments of highs, right? I loved him. I felt like our souls were connected. So it was this, and perhaps that's also why I felt so deeply, because it wasn't like I married someone I wasn't attracted to. It wasn't like I married someone I didn't feel anything towards. It was just fast and furious, good, and then just like these extreme lows where, I would have this sense of the pit in my stomach of like, oh no, here it goes again. And there were these moments, back in the first year before I had, my first child, that I just like part of me, I just felt like the easiest way out would be if I died. I would sit and look out the window when I was alone at home and I would cry. Then I would say like, okay, like I can't call my parents. I wish, I'm sure they, desperately would have wanted to know earlier. And I would encourage anyone who feels these feelings to please reach out to people that love you. But back then, even though I was raised in a home where I was loved and where we got to express our feelings, somehow this feeling of shame prevented me to do that. Also, the feeling of disloyalty to him because I loved him. And because, the college class teacher said, never tell your mother about your fights because she'll never forget, even when you do. These idioms that you were told.
Your parents are good. Don't talk to people about your problems.
Yeah.
Marriage between you and your spouse.
Very private.
All of that is actually so destructive. I'm sure it's well intentioned. And at the same time, it is really keeping abused. It's protecting abuse. It's protecting the wrong people, right? Where you speak about, I didn't want to be disloyal to my husband, but in that process, you are disloyal to yourself. And that's like, we're not raising our girls to learn how to be loyal to themselves. And that's the problem.
And even back then, like Alaya, like he hadn't raised his hands. He hadn't gotten physically violent. But it was this, I don't feel okay. And you kind of, you're not listening to your gut that's telling you, I don't feel okay. Or perhaps you are, where you have a good cry and you say, okay, soldier on. No one said marriage was easy. And the other, the other things I was talking about earlier, but it's, yeah, I look back at that as like a really missed opportunity to get out in a place where my future children wouldn't have been exposed to abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. That's a heavy thing to sit with. We're going to get to like where your children fit into this and how that all showed up with this. But I'm really hoping that even just from what we've shared so far, and we have so much more to get into, that people are listening to this and getting a lot of really valuable insight into how to prepare their children better, how to shift the way that they are seeing marriage and marital conflict, relationship conflict, and more rooted in reality and understanding where normal stops and abuse begins. Ooh, that's really the title of relationship classes, where normal stops and abuse begins.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this was definitely not normal.
So in the beginning, right, and I know that you said like that you would just sit and think, oh, my only way out is to die. Did you ever think of leaving in any other capacity? Did that cross your mind?
Interesting. No. His threat to me constantly was that he was going to divorce me. Now, to me, I guess now I know, right? Stability is probably one of my strongest needs as a human. Stable, safe stability. Um, and so to me, divorce was his threat to me. So no, I don't know. And so much of me wishes I would have, but somehow I didn't see that as a viable option. One, potentially because of the shame of a failed marriage, right? The fact that this shidduchim I find to be like essentially sucks the our identities out of us. And what I mean by identity is like that I am a woman, I am a person, I deserve to be happy, I deserve that my needs are met, I deserve to live in a level of happiness and tranquility. Because we're all so worried about which boy's going to date us, who's going to say yes, right? In the world of shidduchim, it's a boys' market for the most part. And I was one of those that had plenty of dates, right? I came from a nice family. My parents were comfortable. I was pretty. It wasn't like my mom had to chase down shadchanim to get me dates. But still, the year of dating that I had, I didn't feel connection, and I felt like I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy dating. And it was kind of like, okay, well, this is who I connected to. So this is my lot in life. This is my bashar.
Yeah. And it's such a common experience where people would rather be married than safe and happy. Sure, we all say that ideally we want to be married, safe, and happy, but over and over and over, and this crosses, all religions and all cultures and socioeconomic statuses. Far too often, people are prioritizing being married or staying married over their safety and happiness.
100%. Yeah.
Part of that is, like you said, because of our core need for stability and safety and familiarity. And part of that is because of the way that we are portraying that marriage completes you and marriage fulfills you and marriage turns you into a person and marriage gives you status and credibility. And we need to break that. We really need to break that, because this is the impact of it. Like this,
yeah.
When it goes wrong, sometimes it goes beautifully, right? But we need to change where it's going wrong. So tell us the first couple of years of your marriage. Like, what did things look like? How did they escalate over time? Tell us a little bit of that.
So I think it took, I had my first child within a year, before our first anniversary. I actually was one of the radicals that went and got a heter on birth control because I did not want to have my kids back to back. And I was open-minded enough to know that it was an option to me. I ended up getting pregnant again 8 months in. So my first two kids are like about a year and a half apart or so. And I remember that the first time he hit me, I was pregnant, I was holding my then baby in my arms. And I remember those words my mom had said to me, which was, the first time he hits you, that's when you leave. And I remember thinking like, well, it doesn't actually play out in reality, because here I am, pregnant with my second child, living in another country. And guess what? It's just not practical. I kind of think that pregnancy was difficult, in that there were like instances of violence. And I remember probably during that second pregnancy where the first time it was crystal clear to me that there was something beyond that, there was something wrong with him. Like in my mind, I said, oh my God, you're crazy. I had a moment where, I don't know, I must have been like about 6, 7 months pregnant. So like heavily pregnant. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know what it was I did, but I clearly infuriated him. And he was pounding my head against the bedpost. And as he was doing it, he was screaming out, look at what you make me do. And I remember like having that, you know, those CNN banners that say the news outside of the city buildings. I had that banner going across my head to say, oh my God, he's really crazy. Because it wasn't something that I could like rationalize in any sort of way. And I just felt so terrible for this child that was in me that was experiencing this violence too. Like it was my job as a mother to protect this child, and somehow this is what was happening. Um, yeah, we ended up moving back from Israel right before having my second child. And no, we had these periods. I don't want to say that there was ever really an extended period of honeymoon. There was always this, you know, where your stomach like kind of sinks again and you know that you're going into it. It was inevitable. And something that was very common for us was, I mean, believe it or not, I'm a pretty strong person. So like that self-confidence that I had in me, that little voice in me would sometimes say like, no, you're not wrong. No, you didn't do anything wrong. No, answer. And somehow that always got me into so much trouble. And some of it was just mental exhaustion that, let's say, I felt like, okay, let me broach this. Hey, this is wrong. This really upset me. You really hurt my feelings. I'm really not feeling okay. Somehow, inevitably, our our interactions, especially when they were like problem solving, shall I say, was so twisted that inevitably it would come back and it was me. It was my fault. So I would have these moments where I doubted my mind. I doubted my rational thinking. But that little voice inside me said, no, you're not crazy. No, you have a point. No, this is not right. But, you know, at this point, there were 2 kids. I happened to have had more very fertile, more unplanned pregnancies. And yeah, I guess through it all, there were moments of sweetness and there were moments of where there were genuine smiles. But at a certain point, I think I was just numb on the inside. And my day-to-day survival was just, okay, this is my reality. This is my lot in life. You know, do the best you can, be the best mother you can to your children.
There's so many like points that you made here that are so classic. Look what you're making me do, right? Just very classic gaslighting and victim blaming. You angered him to the point. There is no such thing. There's no such thing as angering somebody to the point of physical abuse. Like there is no victim blame in that. Nothing. It is a one-sided experience. Like nothing. And abusers will always convince their victims that you push me to this point. I don't want to be doing this to you. You think I like having to hurt you? All of these are just very classic phrases. And not only are they not factually true, but they are just an added layer of abuse, actually. So there's the physical abuse being, perpetrated in that moment. And then there's also the emotional and mental and verbal abuse of the moment by also then convincing you that somehow you caused this, you made this happen, you pushed them to the edge. They would never act like this if it wasn't for you.
Yeah.
So many times
Yeah.
you think that you're just dramatic, or the crazy one, or just overly sensitive. All of that is part of the abuse itself. And it's so important that we start to call that out and see it for what it is and empower people to also call it for what it is and see it as that. And the other point that you made that I want to also touch on is, like that there's this advice of like the first time he hits you, just leave. And I love how you said it's just not practical. And I think that there's such a common, it's really a judgment, right? Where we look at women and men in abusive relationships, like, well, why didn't you just leave? Why did you tolerate it? Like, why would you accept that? Right? And there is inherent judgment in that. And I think that people just really don't stop and realize like what it looks like to essentially blow up your life. And you put it so simple, like it's just not practical, right? But it's not like it's just not practical. It's like that is a huge freaking deal to leave small babies and at that point, right, your self-esteem is also shattered, by the way, because that's like part of the abuse as well. So you also have to like, even if I leave, I'm going to fail at it. And it's not like I can handle my life on my own. I'm incapable of everything, right? Because they're also systemically completely eroding your self-esteem. No one else will want you. No one will believe you. So it's like, where do you go? What do you do? Like we really have to get rid of the judgment toward people for why do they stay. The real question should be like, how did you miraculously leave? We need to start looking at leaving as like the incredible miracle versus like, how could you possibly stay?
Yeah.
So I want to hear now about, at what point did you label it abuse? At what point did you start using the word abuse to yourself? Like, when did you say, hey, I'm in an abusive relationship?
That's such an interesting question. I read a lot. I remember reading a Velvet Plane novel. I don't remember the title, but it was a story, and in the story there was domestic violence. And I remember thinking to myself, that's me. And then I was like, no, that's not me. And I was like, yeah, that's you. And it's like talking to myself almost in a sense where your brain doesn't want to accept that this is your reality. But I think clearly when he hit me, probably 2 years into our marriage, I knew that was abuse, but somehow I didn't label it as abuse. And he would say to me things like, I don't hit you every day. I don't say I don't like supper and I hit you. Every once in a while, I get really upset. So, oh my God, the absurdity of how ridiculous that comment is today. And I remember thinking, like, you're right, there are some people that get beaten every single day. I don't walk around all the time with black and blue marks, but I had moments where I felt so alone. I once got a wisdom tooth pulled, and this was when my kids were in school already, and my face, my one side of my face turned like really black and blue, and one of my kids had a play date, and the mom jokingly said, like, oh boy, your face looks terrible. If I wouldn't know you, I would think. And inside my head, I was like, yeah, if you only knew, but you just, I had moments where well before it took me like 5-6 years to say something to my parents. But I remember my mother one day said to me, does he hit you? And I said, like in this nervous laugh, like, no, why would you say that? And she said to me, you're awfully nervous around him. I don't know if back then we were in a honeymoon phase post an incident, shall I say. But, I did have this unexplained loyalty to protecting him because, God forbid, nobody should know what us, a nice looking couple, actually happened behind closed doors. But more and more, I felt dead inside. Like I was really like very spiritual, and I just became very numb. Like I could not feel, I could not dive in. Like if I allowed myself to feel, I would fall apart. There was one Rosh Hashanah where we had like a violent incident also, like bashing heads. And also with the crazy, I think there was some choking involved there too, because I woke up the next morning and I had a black and blue mark on my neck. And I remember trying to figure out if the choker that I had gotten when I was engaged, if it would cover the scar. And I remember sitting in shul next to his mother, and thinking in my head, if you only knew what a monster your son is, right? But then also like dead inside of like, God, I really don't know what you want from me. And if I'm supposed to be like davening for the next year of life in my life, then please just take me out of this misery and protect me, because I don't have words to ask for help anymore. I think I processed life by just being numb and just surviving.
Wow. I'm like, I mean, I've heard you tell me this story before, but every time I hear it, it's like I'm right there in that moment and I'm like visualizing it, but I also can't even wrap my head around that. Like just all the factors, like using your engagement necklace to cover up, like using your engagement choker to cover up bruises from being choked.
Yeah.
And doing that, sitting in synagogue on the high holidays next to your mother who raised this man, who just that moment, just such insanity. I mean, that right there, there's really just no words for a moment like that. Then, like you said, oh God, like I have no words for you, so you do your thing. Like I am out.
Yeah. No, I mean, honestly, I look back at I tell this story. I mean, thank God I'm many years past this. I am at this point on the outside looking in. And it is so hard to reconcile in my logical brain that that was my reality. But it was. And there were moments where, I mean, there was nothing to do other than survive.
Yeah, and you know, so often I think this also goes back to where people are like, well, why didn't you like realize what was going on, or ask for help, or make any changes? And I would like to remind all of them that that requires accessing capacities and areas of your brain that you are just not in touch with when you are so focused on just survival, like strategizing and problem solving and coming up with solutions and processing what's going on, and all of that we don't have access to when we're just surviving, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. That's all. So, like, again, it's just the miracle is that people leave. So you did leave at a certain point. Tell us about that. I mean, you left more than once. So tell us, like, the first time that.
Yeah, I'll go back. I'll rewind a little bit more, because somewhere before I left the first time, I found my voice. There was a moment where he was violent, and he was violent in front of, at that point, our youngest child. And I remember like getting out of the room, locking myself in the bathroom. It was Shabbos. At that point, you know, how dare I lock myself in the bathroom? At that point, he barricaded me into the bathroom because, like, yeah. And I remember telling him, I'm going to tell your parents what you do to me. His parents happened to have lived within walking distance of us. And at that point, he didn't let me out of the bathroom. I had to beg. And I did. I walked over to his parents, and it was a Friday night, and I said, I need to tell you what your son is doing to me. His mother said something to the effect of, I was waiting for the day that you were going to tell us about this, which my today brain wants to like just say to her, well, why didn't you do something about it before, if that's what you thought of? But yeah, my brain wasn't working that well then. And that Saturday night, I told my parents, and my parents were horrified. I think probably, so they immediately were like, we need to get into professional help. I mean, obviously, I know my parents wanted me to leave, but at that point, we started professional help. And I think once we started marriage counseling, I understood that, you know, violence was just that I was able to, you know, I would need the courage, but I could call the police, that there were avenues there that I could help myself. And there was a moment where, you know, he was violent, and I called 911, and, you know, I had the bruises. I got an order of protection. And at that point, he was out of the house for several months. But at that time, he really, you know, for the first time said, I was wrong. I love you so much.
Please don't give up on us. I'll go for help. I'll take medication to regulate my moods. I wasn't allowed to know what medication he was on, so much so that our medical insurance, he would only fill his prescription in a private pharmacy where it couldn't be tracked. We had some elements of paranoia there too. But hard to say how back then I still had feelings for him, but I really felt like if he's gonna, he's admitting that he was wrong and he is going for help and he's going for therapy and he's going to get on medication, and the fact that I continue to what I thought was love him, and the fact that we have these children together, let me give it a chance to keep the family together. Look, it's always easy to second guess your thoughts. If I was to tell myself back then, I would say, no, 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 don't go back. My parents said, no, 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 please don't go back. We worry about you. We're scared for you. But I did go back. We were in constant marriage counseling after that. And it took another, couple of years. And then, at that point, I got the courage to get out. I think at that point, I was so numb on the inside that I actually, shall I say, he figuratively beat the love out of me.
Wow. I think you can say that literally as well. You didn't just figuratively beat the love out of you, literally.
So the interesting thing is that in our second reconciliation, he actually didn't hit, choke, kick. He would do other things like back me into corners, not let me leave, be very scary. And to that, I will say that in the world of abuse, you really can't measure. I mean, I know that physical abuse is deemed, the worst of the worst, and it is just about the worst thing that can happen. But I will say that mental and emotional abuse probably cuts you down just as much.
Yeah. There's a therapist that I speak to. I just very, very, very much respect and admire her. And she's worked a lot with adult victims of child sexual abuse. And I was once talking to her about sexual abuse, and she said the only form of abuse that comes close to sexual abuse on a child is emotional abuse. It has the same effect. It's a spiritual abuse. It breaks the spirit of the person receiving it. So we think physical abuse. Physical abuse is the easiest to identify. It requires a type of rage and a complete lack of self-control. And in that sense, it is the most intense form of abuse, right? Because how completely out of control and dysregulated do you have to be to physically assault another person? But in terms of impact and the depths of how a type of abuse can cut you, emotional abuse is actually equivalent to sexual abuse. Like they are the two worst forms of abuse.
Right. When I ask myself, like, what was it that made me have the courage to say I want a divorce? I will say that there were several factors, right? It was a lot of light bulb moments. I had good friends that were there for me and really gave me some tough love. Like, this is not love.
I want to get to that question when we can explore.
Sure.
I want to be able to explore that properly. And what I'm thinking, actually, I would like to do, Yael, and tell me if you're willing to do that, is because we still have like another whole chunk of your story, and I don't want to rush anything. I want us to be able to give everything the space that it needs. And I'm thinking that your story is so powerful, and everything that you and I are discussing here is so powerful. I'm thinking that we divide this into a 2-part episode. That we do part 1, and then part 2 we'll go into why you decided to come back, and we'll kind of pick it up from there and keep going. What do you say to doing something?
Let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're my first 2-part guest. Because there's still so much that I want to explore, and I don't want to rush through any of it. So let's wait 1 second. There was something that you said that I wanted to touch on. I wanted to really just congratulate you and just celebrate with you. And I know that this is, I mean, how long ago are we talking at this point? We never even gave like the dates for any of this. How many years ago was it that you left for the first time?
Almost 20 years ago.
That's incredible. I think this is going to be very surprising for our listeners. I think everybody hearing you is going to assume you were so much younger. Like only now.
Yeah, it takes that long to really unpack in a way that you can speak somewhat dispassionately about this. Yeah.
That's a really important point also. We say, like, why don't people speak up? Like, look, it's 20 years post this experience. This is your first time really sharing your story and feeling ready and empowered enough to do that. So yeah, it takes a while to process trauma. But 20 years ago when you that night where you just took your voice and you went and you told his parents and you went and you told your parents and you called the police on him the next time something happened. I mean, that is something worth celebrating even 20 years later. Like that's just beyond incredible. And for what it's worth, and I hope it's worth something, like hearing you say that, I'm like, yes, girl, you go queen. Yeah, you own your boys. You know, like, yes, I'm so proud of you for doing that. Like going to a man's parents, being like, hey, your little monster of a kid has been abusing me for years. And then telling your parents, I mean, that's so huge. Like, I'm so proud of you 20 years ago. It's just like so incredible that you did that. And I really just, when it's like honored, like if we were texting, I'd be sending you all the GIFs right now of like, yeah, Williams applauded, Meryl Streep cheering you on.
Yeah.
So I hope everybody listening is like just as proud of you. Okay, so we are going to pause here for part 1, and then we'll pick this up and we'll do part 2. I'm really looking forward. I hope that all of you will share your feedback on this first part. And obviously, if any of this has struck a chord with you, you can reach out to Shalom Task Force. They are an organization dedicated to supporting people stuck in situations of domestic violence or shelters in your area, or maybe at this point, disclose to your parents, disclose to your friends, call professionals, call the authorities if you need to. You don't have to wait for part 2 in order to start asking for help and talking about what's going on in your life. So yeah, thank you so much for doing part 1. And I'm so looking forward to speaking to you for part 2. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Ascend. I'm Alaya, and I hope you heard something today that can spark healing, growth, or a deeper passion for your life. I'd love to hear your takeaways from this episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe via YouTube or Apple/Spotify. Follow me on Instagram @AlayaBCoaching for more exciting content. Until the next time we ascend together.